Hello everyone, this is Naoto, and in this tutorial I would like to cover some techniques using Hydra modulation functions and look into depth to see what's possible with the modulation and the family of modulation functions. Let's start. So if you're not familiar with Hydra, you should take a look at some tutorials or online books, articles, and this tutorial is rather for people who are already familiar with basic syntax and functions. So, first thing I think most of the people would do with modulation is, let's say you have noise or some kind of source in here, and you use the default parameter 0.1, for example. If you keep this 0, then there is no modulation, and if you make it 1, then you see something appear that is similar to this base function that modulates the oscillator. And this is fun. You can have different functions like shape that kind of shifts the color in the middle, or Voronoi, and you can also chain modulation. To do something crazy. And you can just explore by chaining functions, but here I want to see a bit more of what's happening inside modulation. And to do so, I use gradient here with -1. And what's happening here is in Modulate, this is the idea. Idea is that it pushes pixels to the direction of this texture. I don't know if it's clear, but in the case of gradient, because the gradient texture is in the x direction, the horizontal direction, it becomes more red, and in the vertical direction to down, it becomes more green. And on this corner where I am, it becomes yellow because it's a mixture of red and green. And if you push these pixels to -1, then all the pixels will actually end up in the top left. It's sampled by the color over here. If you see, for example, just render it together with other buffer that only has this function, then it becomes clear that this edge color is sampled and replacing all the pixels in this texture, so it becomes uniform. And this is actually, if you might have noticed, but has the same effect as doing pixelate 1, 1, which is actually somewhat different because pixelate is sampling from the center of the image instead of the top left. So if you do this, there's like discontinuity in the color just because of the place where it's sampled. Okay, so since we have this, I want to make something similar to pixelate. Let's say if I have pixelate 10, 10, then you have 10 by 10 blocks, which is not so obvious in here, so I would do rotate. So now we have the grid of pixels with pixelate, and I want to recreate with modulate and gradient. I would first try with repeating the gradient with 10 by 10, because this will actually end up with a texture that is a grid, and I think this will be sufficient. But actually what's happening here is think I still need to do, like strictly speaking, I need to do here dot add gradient, another gradient, to make it a complete repeat. So this is actually, instead of making a pixelate, I made repeat 10 by 10. Again, it's a slightly different because of the place the pixel is sampled, but it's almost same as repeat. But what I wanted to make is actually pixelate. So what's wrong here is all the pixels in this block, in this block, in this block, they have the same, almost the same effect compared to other pixels or blocks. So I need to, I think, make it a bit less, because we have 10 by 10, so I think this should be 1 over 10. And now we have this magically happened, because in this each block, they will all look for the sample, the top left block, by this gradient and multiplied by minus 1 over 10. Okay, this looks a bit cheating, but if you do the math, it's actually correct. And what's interesting with this is, because now you would wonder, because if you do this with Pixelate, it's the same result. So why am I doing this complicated way to do it? One interesting thing you could do is to mask or mount this texture, the modulator texture, with, for example, shape. Then you'll have only pixelation happening in this shape. Maybe I could make it bigger. This is still possible with using, I think, a layer of this pixelated and masked by the same shape. Maybe I'm missing one more. Okay, it's again, it's a bit shifted, but it's almost the same effect. So this is not competition, but just to show what's interesting with this is that, okay, keep this. I can also do blurry shape. For example, like with the third parameter of the shape, it makes blurry one. And it becomes somewhat interesting because in the middle, they are almost perfectly pixelated, but close to the edge of the shape, you see kind of a smooth transition of the pixelation, which is actually not possible in the case of the layer because it's just overlaying it. So you would see, well, actually, you see something similar. So maybe there's no benefit of Modulate, but this is kind of the thing that I've been experimenting, and let's see what other things are possible with Modulate. I'm gonna try with the shape, and I want to see Modulate. Let's say this time instead of noise, I would like to use oscillator. And I think you have seen this kind of pattern before if you're experimenting with Hydra and modulation. And what's bothering me is that there's like weird discontinuity, and also it's a bit unpredictable because actually this modulation is happening to not to completely to the side or to the top, but it's actually happening diagonally in the screen. Because Modulate is sampling this texture, and specifically the color channel red and green. So let's see what happens. And actually it's not looking for blue or alpha channels. So if you do this, you'll get the same result. But if you do this, then you start to see interesting change. Here, we're only preserving the red channel, so the pixels are only shifted in the horizontal direction. And if you do this, and I don't need this anymore, so I delete them. And now pixels are pushed only to the vertical direction. What I like to do is keep the oscillator really small and really fast like this. Maybe a bit faster. And I can just increase this parameter a little bit. And now you see something like scroll function with a sine wave. And its sides are a little bit tilted because if you look at this texture, it's not completely uniform. So, for example, you can use Modulate or Pixelate, like the trick I used, to keep it a single color. And if you apply it here, then you will see this shape without deformation. It starts to move in the horizontal direction, or you can scroll it in the horizontal direction, vertical or horizontal. And you might notice that it actually comes only to the center, and it goes back to the left, center, and it won't go to the direction here. If you want to do it, that's happening because oscillator is outputting value from 0 to 1. And instead I want to do brightness that subtracts or adds the value. Well, usually adds the value, but I would use minus to subtract the value so that the range of oscillator becomes 0 to 1 to minus 0.5 to 0.5. Maybe I can increase this a bit. So now you see I'm actually using Modulate to move the pixels. And actually you can Modulate scroll X has a bug, so it doesn't work at the moment. But yeah, with Modulate and Pixelate brightness color, you can emulate something like this. And again, what's really the benefit of this? So I'd move it to vertical direction, and again you can do it with the same thing with scroll Y, and we have something like this. Probably this will overshoot. Yeah, because I think something like this would work. So here you're seeing something similar to what I have with Modulate, and this is probably more intuitive because you have this equation here as a function, and that determines the scroll. The reason why I recommend using this is, for example, if you change the pixelation, then you can apply different effects to different parts of the image. Or if I do it this way, then now you see that these boxes are chopped and modulated or scrolled with different parameters. Of course, I can use this to make it faster, or another way to do it is to apply this is to use Modulate Scale. In this case, instead of shifting the pixels, the scaling parameter becomes this function is applied as a scaling factor. So the first one is the scaling factor, and then another one is offset. I can say the offset is really small, and yes, this would be more interesting. You can change the pixelate. Of course, you don't have to do pixelate. If you take this out, then you will see sine curves. Okay, so here are modulate scale and modulate. And the next thing I want to introduce is modulate pixelate. So I would start with a noise. And if you do modulate pixelate with maybe the same function, oops, then you will end up with a mess, which is quite interesting. But you don't see any pixelation effect in this image because the noise function itself is quite organic and it doesn't have any structure, so that we want to add a bit of structure to this. Let's say 8 by 8. And now it becomes more interesting because the factor of pixelation is determined by this function, which in each block, again, they have the same color. So within this block, they have the same pixelation factor. So now you start to see some kind of structure, but still it's a bit too pixelated. You don't see the original texture. So I usually use this multiply parameter really big. So if the pixel is bright, you will see less pixelation, because if you have pixelate with big number, you have less pixelation effect. So I have here 512, for example. I mean, this is quite arbitrary. I just like the power of 2 to the power of something. So I just do it like this, but this is offset. So if the pixel is dark, then it will end up something close to this. And it's not like interpolation between 8 and 512, but it's interpolation between 8 and 520, I guess. But anyways, it's a bit of a estimation. And now you see that the pixels close to the edge of this noise has really interesting pixelation effect that's modulating all the time. And this is different across the space depending on the brightness of the noise. Okay, and this is something that you cannot simulate only with pixelate. And I think that's when you start to understand modulate and modulate pixelate, you can do these tricks. The last thing I want to do is, let's go back to the noise, and I would add a bit of color before going to the last one by doing, this is my favorite palette, and if you add noise, if you modulate with the noise, I mean, this is too humble, so I'll just make this parameter really big. I call this like a color remap. Well, specifically, if you have gradient -1, then you're actually remapping the brightness to this input palette, which is, again, if you do the math, you will probably figure out, or I wrote an article that explains why this set of modulation will remap the brightness of this noise pattern into this color palette. But let's keep it aside, and I will use this as a source. And here I want to use modulate rotate, for example. And here, okay, let's say oscillator. And now again, it's a little bit chaotic. You might see some kind of frequency, like from the oscillator here. Like if you have something smaller, then yeah, this is a bit too humble. But if you make it high, then you see the frequency of the oscillator. But it doesn't really look like rotate. It's because modulate rotate or any other rotation function will rotate the pixel with regard to the center of the texture. So if you have, for example, maybe 10 and colored, if you have a texture that is symmetric or like circular, something like this, I think I can increase this a bit more, then I just imagine that if this is input as a modulate rotate, then the pixels will have like a uniform rotation within each ring, and as a result you will see something like this. I would make this parameter a little bit bigger. This is the multiply and offset. For now, I'll just keep it to 0 or maybe -3. Maybe this is too much. So you can just always play with the parameters, but now you see that it's symmetric. Well, not symmetric, but it preserves the circular pattern of collate, and also rotate is just amplifying how much you rotate this image. Well, this is not maybe not the most obvious example, so I just use shape, for example, like this. And again, I like to use a bit of blurry circle. And now you see this swirl kind of effect. That's because shape is, with this parameter, it becomes like a blurry circle. So if you apply this as a rotation, then in the center it has stronger rotation, and if you go to the outer side, then it has less rotation. Or you can always invert, and the outer side has more rotation. Well, actually, in this case, it doesn't really matter. It just flips the direction of the rotation. Maybe this is too much. And if you keep the offset as a half of multiply, then it will move from -4.5 to 4.5. It's a simple math. I want to animate this, so I will multiply this with an oscillator. Again, I like to use this one, maybe 1.3. Pixelate 1. In the case of oscillator, anyways, the second parameter doesn't matter because vertically the pixels are the same. So now you see this interesting animation. If you take just this part, it's just blinking. But if you apply this function as modulate rotate, then you see the texture to start rotate. And these parameters I don't really like because it's actually rotating to the same direction all the time. So I just keep it, yeah, maybe 6. And I want to make it rotate to the other side as well. And to do so, I think, again, because oscillator is going from 0 to 1, I just do brightness and minus 0.5. So it's remapped from 0 to 1 to -0.5 to 0.5. Now we have a rotation in both directions. Okay, so this is the end of the tutorial, and I also wrote an article about this, so if you want to follow it by reading, let's say, or there's actually interactive examples in the article, so please follow that as well if you don't want to type these in, but if you just want to copy from the article, that's also possible. And if you have questions, please ask me on Twitter, or I'm also active on Hydra Discord server, so feel free to reach out to me. Thank you for watching.